a very warm welcome to you all. My name's Chris Borg, Policy Manager at NALC. It's my pleasure to be chairing today's online event from NALC on Finance and Function, powering up parish and town councils. First, I'd like to quickly run through a few housekeeping announcements, which won't take long. Some of them are shown on the slide on the screen in front of you. Do use the Q&A function, please, throughout the event to put questions to our speakers, and the chat function to interact with your fellow delegates and to share any information or links. If you need any technical support, please do post that in the chat, and my NALC colleague, Liv, will do her best to help. Now for closed captions. The closed captions feature, which is subtitles, can be accessed by all attendees at any time during today's event. For desktop and laptop users, to turn on closed captions, please select Show Captions. The button will be labelled CC. If the button isn't visible, please select the three dots on the bottom right corner of the screen. Then please select Captions, and after that, you'll be prompted to click Show Captions, so please select that option. If you're using a mobile phone or tablet, please scroll across the menu on the bottom of your screen and select Captions. You'll then need to click Show Captions. Moving on. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties at all during the event, please contact NALC support via the chat. We'll endeavour to rectify the issue for you. Once closed captions are on, of course, you can access a live transcription of the event, just to finish that tech bit. And after the event, we'll send you the presentation, any presentation slides. I don't believe any of our speakers actually in the event, need to use them. But any of the links that are forwarded to us, we'll include those in the post-event mailing. And any other useful information, including the chat. And we'll be also inviting your feedback on today's event, so please do look out for the feedback form, which should pop up on your screens following the conclusion of today's webinar. All of you delegates will be muted on entry, so please don't be surprised by that. That's just part of the Zoom webinar platform we're using. Sponsor slide, please, Liv. Thanks. Now, would like to thank its partners, Clear, Unity Trust Bank and CCLA for their extensive support for today's NALC online event. Next slide, please, Liv. Thanks. Okay, so about today's event and what you've come here to hear about. So as local government in England undergoes sweeping change, new unitary councils are facing tough financial headwinds and national policies leaning towards neighbourhood area committees rather than creating new parish and town councils, although we'll see what the final version of the bill today or tomorrow looks like. But where challenges do arise, so do opportunities. This is the moment for parish and town councils to take the lead, to champion local voices, secure vital services, and prove the power of community-led delivery. Join us for a dynamic and solution-focused event today, where you'll discover practical strategies to build effective partnerships with your principal authority, including county councils and others. Explore how service level agreements can safeguard the services your residents rely on and gain the tools and confidence to drive real change in your community. Be part of the movement today that keeps our communities thriving, and don't just adapt to change, lead it, as you'll hear from our three speakers. Every size of parish and town council will gain something, hopefully by having attended today's event. And just discussing one of the speakers, there seemed to be a fair range of you as well from principal authorities attending, so that's brilliant to see. So I'm thrilled to be joined today by a brilliant panel of speakers, and huge thanks to them for joining us. Helen Ball, Clerk at Shrewsbury Town Council, Simon Edwards, Chief Exec at the County Councils Network, and Colin Poole, Clerk at Haverhill Town Council. So now, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Simon to kick the proceedings off. Over to you, Simon.
Thank you, Chris, and hello to colleagues. So I'm delighted once again, I do this regularly, to speak to an audience of town and parish councils, and I don't say this to ingratiate myself with you, but I'm a huge believer in the importance of local councils, and unlike others, I see you as an integral and full part of the local government family, and always have. I mean, for years I've worked closely with Justin and colleagues and Chris, and as a judge on NALC Star Council Awards for many years, I've always been incredibly impressed with the breadth and the scope of the work you undertake in your communities every day. Now, today I was asked to speak specifically in terms of the local government reorganisation that this government decided to pursue in 21 remaining two-tier county areas. which also included a number of neighbouring unitaries involving more than well over a third of England's population, and hopefully set the scene for contributions of fellow panellists and the question and discussion sessions afterwards on the challenges and opportunities. I mean, those that know me and have heard me speak before, I hope, would say that I'm normally a positive in my outlook and focus more on the opportunities than the challenges, or at least solutions to those challenges. But I'm going to apologise in advance for what will probably be and feel a downbeat and depressing analysis of what is currently happening and the implications for councils at all levels. Before I bring the mood down, I do think it is worth reflecting very, very briefly in the time we have on previous reorganisations and town and parish councils. Now, I make no apology for being an advocate of LGR if done well. And by that, I mean making principal councils of size and scale, joining up services, minimising disruption, maximising savings, and delivering councils based on sensible and historic identity. What that allows, I think, is councils of the right size, county unitaries of the right size, to be strategic and leaving the space for area boards of councils working alongside empowered town and parish councils to do the very local. I'm not saying that everything has been perfect and that new county unitaries have always got things right. Neither have the existing two-tier counties. But when you look at examples like Durham and Wiltshire and Cornwall and many others, I think you can see a model which does and can work, and one which can be built on in the future, and one that I expected any change to be built on in the future. So I'll leave that there. We can explore any of that, but let's looking forward. Let's move on to the current debacle. Firstly, I suppose I was really shocked to see diktats coming from ministers and civil servants that as part of this new round of LGR, they didn't want to see new town and parish councils, and certainly ones with precepting powers. And as I said, I think this is a model that's tried and tested, and we should be building on this. And maybe that was a portent of what was to come. And perhaps this particular issue is something that we can get into in the discussion, what comes out of the bill, but also what we all intend to do about it. And I'd like your take on that. So apart from that one issue, I thought it was a relatively positive start. There were some really clear criteria set out in the white paper: large populations of over 500,000, built on county geographies, avoiding costly and risky fragmentation of critical services for vulnerable adults and children, which is where most of the money goes, minimise disruption to other key services, and maximise savings. I mean, in their own white paper, the government even quoted the PwC report, which demonstrated the possibility of up to 2 billion in savings, which could be ploughed back into local services if done at scale. I suppose it's also important to note here, though, in the context of what I'll say next, that this same report also suggested if done badly, and I don't think anyone thought it would be done this badly, LGR could cost £1 billion. That's a 3 billion swing in straitened financial times, not something I don't think we can afford. So councils were asked to submit proposals based on these criteria. And we saw sensible, costed and deliverable proposals by most counties, some districts and some neighbouring unitaries. But we also saw some quite frankly ridiculous proposals which didn't meet any of the criteria, were built on fantasy economics and had no viable delivery plans. It was clear through all my contacts across government that civil servants in key departments, MHCLG, Treasury, DFE, DHSE, etc., they understood the evidence, both from previous rounds of LGR, the examples that had gone on before, but also the modelling. And their initial advice to ministers was to deliver LGR on the basis of the criteria that the government set out. Now, tragically, and I don't use that word lightly, the decisions arrived at by ministers in the first 4 areas, the DPP areas to be announced, not only went against every one of their own criteria, but in almost every area chose the worst possible proposals. Small unitaries, dubious geographies, maximising disruption and complexity, fragmenting adults and children's services into small units has never been done before like this, and proposals that will cost millions, not save billions. And these decisions will leave many of the new unitaries on financial life support from birth and potentially for a generation. These new councils will undergo complex experimental reorganisation, including ward level, parish level boundary changes that have never been done before during LGR. And that means any opportunities for wider public service reform, including work with parish and town councils, will not be at the forefront of anyone's mind as they try to stay safe and legal and then spend years unpicking the complex and chaotic nature of the decisions and the process they've had to go through. Now, whilst this is only 4, and they haven't yet made decisions on the remaining 16 areas, which they're supposed to do in the next couple of months, my fear is that this model will be replicated across the country with dire consequences in those areas. And I think particularly dire consequences for the more rural areas of England where parish and towns councils are strongest. It's absolutely clear, that these were politically led, not evidence-led decisions, carving out some potential urban political enclaves to satisfy MPs and party, and the implications for the rural areas, particularly after the so-called Fair Funding Review, are really genuinely stark. And if it's possible, looking further ahead, it's worse than all that. Because my belief is, having gone completely against the criteria and the interests of the services they are responsible for, DFE and DHSE in particular, will now reach for mitigations to try to minimise the potential damage to adults and children's services. And I think they'll resurrect the discredited trust shared services models, which are widely rejected by experts and those with any knowledge of the subject. These services then may be removed from direct control of councils, and the next logical step is for them, along with other strategic services, to be given to the ever-expanding mayoral portfolios. And what does that mean? I think it means that many unitaries, the new unitaries, will be sort of effectively super districts on a slightly larger scale than they currently are. We'll recreate 2-tier local government, just on a slightly larger scale, or 3-tier again, when we include town and parish councils, of course, and leave new, slightly larger unitaries than the districts they replace, competing with town and parish councils on who delivers genuinely local services when a lot of the strategic services are gone. And I haven't, none of that even takes into account the huge political changes that these areas are going through. We're expecting massive changes in leadership of councils in May and subsequent years. Many new councillors with little experience of running large complex councils who will not only have to get to grip with running their council, but at the same time be involved in complex, costly fragmentation. And then the setting up and the running of brand new councils they neither proposed or wanted. So we'll have lost money, fragmented services, delivered no savings. What else? Delivered none of the real benefits of joining up county and district services, and left town and parish councils wondering where they fit into all of this, if they can get any airtime with councillors and officers mired in chaos. Now, if there is any chance to inject an element of opportunity or a slightly more positive tone, that in chaos opportunities can present themselves, or maybe more accurately, they can be carved out by innovative and ambitious council leaders and officers in town and parish councils. Now, we're going to work with the councils where decisions have been made if they decide to challenge these decisions, and I expect some judicial reviews. and try to get the government back on track before they make catastrophic decisions in the remaining 16 areas. And we're going to hold the government where we can to account and deliver on the original criteria they ignored. But the government's government, and if and when that is not possible, and we have to live with these decisions, CCM will work with those areas to support them as best we can. And I would very much, I think, want now can local councils be an important part of those discussions. Now, I think that's probably my time. So, having depressed everyone, I'll stop there and allow others to have their say, hopefully more positive, and then happily to have discussion and join in and listen to colleagues' views.
Brilliant. Thanks very much indeed. Simon, can concur with, at least some of what you're saying there, given the passage of the bill and almost everything you've described, rightly there, to a point has at varying degrees been experienced and exposed during the Hansards, during the relevant Commons and Lords stages, of the bill, which is in its death throes at the moment in ping pong. So we'll see what happens there. Yes, we would have, quite frankly, liked to have a more definite recognition of parish and town councils in the bill. And the pattern that seems to be emerging, from what we can see, is a kind of from the deals that have been agreed so far, is more of a kind of like a medium-sized unitary that they're going for, and less of the bigger authorities being created. But we'll certainly see how that pans out. We've also heard it, as you've implied before, Simon raised that it came up at our larger councils committee meeting yesterday, that there may in practice have been a reduction from the initial 500,000 population kind of preference to something like 350,000 in some cases, which may fit with some of the gerrymandered points you were making, which is, I don't know, is that's one thing we've picked up anecdotally. So certainly wouldn't be surprised.
And Chris, sorry, I just saw a comment. So I'm not going to. I can only see things as they flash up at the moment, and we're with the speakers. But someone has said, "Did I realise that this wasn't about devolution and LGR?" But just to be clear, that's what I was asked to do and set the scene for this. We could talk about lots of things. So I just wanted to reassure that person that's what we were asked to talk about, because this has huge implications for town and parish councils in the future.
As it does, Simon, and indeed devolution in the context of previous rounds of LGR, and finance and function or not flowing with liability transfer onto new parishes and existing parishes. Hopefully Helen might touch on some of that a bit later, and Colin from his academic research on it into the past. Devolution is directly a function of LGR, but it's not entirely a function of LGR. So over to you, Colin, to help perhaps layer some context onto the excellent intro from Simon there on your previous dissertation researching into this, and also any experience you've got as clerk to a super council over in Haverhill there. Over to you, Colin.
Great, thank you, Chris. There is actually a very, very strong connection between what Simon's been talking about and about the of what's going to be happening to parish councils. Simon, Chris and I, we met up last week just to compare notes for today. And I commented that I was going to be talking about the findings of my community governance dissertation research. And that was a project looking at the lessons to be learned from asset and service transfers, such as happened in Cornwall, Somerset and Wiltshire. So back then, those principal councils were in financial distress, and local councils found they were in what one town clerk described as a fire sale, taking on a basket of services in a very short period. So I remarked to Simon that at least the Suffolk councils this time are not in that perilous financial position. That earned me a wonderful 5-minute rant from Simon, which I can abridge for you. Not yet. So Simon's view is that when the weight of social care settles on the shoulders of the new unitaries, then there certainly will be a financial crisis. And he thinks that the 3-unitary model in Suffolk, for instance, is unsustainable. I don't know whether he's right about that, but I would certainly be a fool not to take the point. Suppose he is right. Now, my colleagues who kindly shared their experiences of take on assets and services in that fire sale, in some cases, they tripled the size of their town council in 12 months. They've given us lessons to learn, and potentially we have 18 to 36 months to prepare when they had no time to prepare. So, what can we do now to power up our councils? What lessons can we take to guide us on how we spend that time made available? So, many clerks told me that there was little by way of knowledge transfer ahead of taking on assets or services. Some principal council officers who held that knowledge were resentful that their fiefdom was being broken up, and they were in no mood to share. Some clerks said they had to resort to freedom of information requests in order to get the information they needed for the transfer. Now, in a recent project of my own, the local integrated care board was taking the lead, and then the government announced that all of those ICBs had to cut 50% of cost. So the officer on our project was seconded to an internal transformation project, and other contacts, they focused on applying for their own jobs. So all of the knowledge that we were relying on for the project walked off stage. So the message is that in a crisis, all bets are off. Whilst I don't really actually want to take on any assets or services from my district council right now, at the moment, all those officers are in post and they can answer the questions. At the moment, they're willing to work with us, and there's some hope that we might even get some tapered funding as a dowry. So it might well be worth us taking on some things now, whilst our district and county councils are offering them, because we actually might get it on a far better deal than we would during a financial crisis. So I think the first lesson to take away is what we can do now is we can map the potential assets and services we might take on. We can begin to learn about them. And if your council has capacity, think about taking them on early. Capacity was a big theme in the responses I got to my research. That's capacity in terms of senior staff within the town councils having time to do the legwork involved in transfers. But also, if you're going to move from having, say, 30 members of staff to 100 members of staff, you suddenly need a whole backroom team. The HR and payroll is no longer going to be a little part-time task for the clerk. You're going to need somebody dedicated to do that. So the capacity that we actually have to take on services is going to be key. Capacity also means resource in terms of people and things. So my council's expertise is in venues and events. So if we took on, say, the public toilets, well, we're used to looking after venues. We're used to unblocking toilets, that's for sure. So we could certainly take on public toilets. We have the skills, we have the expertise, we have the understanding. But we are not a burial authority, and we don't look after any parks. So if we were to become a burial authority, or if we were offered parks, we would be starting from zero. If your council is already a burial authority, you've got diggers, you've got mowers, you've got trained ground staff. So taking on a bit of green space that's not round a grave is less of a challenge. So you could start to take on more green space because you've already got the expertise and knowledge. For us, it would be a huge deal. So thinking about the things in our areas that we might have to take on, how far away are we from knowing how to do those things? Also, what about our reserves? Now, our £1 million reserve might be healthy for us as a £2 million super council, but it would look rather weedy for a £7 million super duper council, which we might end up becoming. So do we need to start building our reserves and pushing precept increases up? If when we look down the road, if what Simon says comes to pass, then being ready for that fire sale, we need the financial wherewithal. We need that capacity too. Capacity also means having the political will and the democratic mandate to take on these things. So, do your councillors need training to understand the services over which they're going to be governing, not just the officers who are delivering those services? What about getting the public on board? What assets and services matter most to them? After all, the precept in many councils, I've seen they doubled, they tripled, they even ended up 500% higher in a matter of months. For that, you need public support. You can't just do that without public support. So the second lesson to take away is make sure you have the capacity to cope with asset transfers, to run your organisation afterwards, and the necessary support for doing it. Clerks reported that getting costings out of principal councils was hard work, and they said it was often full of holes. That's partly because, of course, when you disaggregate services, you lose the economies of scale that hide the true cost of services. So sometimes they genuinely don't know how much these things cost. So balkanising services amongst parish and town councils loses that economy of scale. We may have ways of doing things more inventively, we may have shortcuts, we may be able to use volunteers in some cases. But we don't necessarily have to take on services by ourselves. There may be better options. Parish councils working together to commission or even deliver services across a larger area. Or perhaps it's easier to leave the knowledge where it is and contract to buy those services from the principal councils. Now, obviously, that leaves you open to increases in costs, and Helen will talk about service level agreements, etc. But these things take time to put together, and they're much harder to achieve in a storm. So if we have time now to have those discussions and those thoughts, it's far better to do it now rather than wait for a financial crash. It's worth saying, as an example, one town council took on so many services in the space of 12 months that their council finances were unrecognisable. That's unrecognisable in such a way that when they did the budget, they had no point of reference to sense check it. The numbers were unrecognisable, and so was the mistake in just one cell on a massive spreadsheet. Now, luckily, they had the reserves to cover the shortfall of that mistake, but it illustrates the risk of taking on so much so quickly that it's easy then to have errors built in because you're simply not used to seeing those numbers. You have no point of reference. So lesson 3 is take this time to fully understand the costs of each new service so that you have that point of reference. And the final one, as always, is that we need to check with our insurers. I know from my own service that our soft play, we insure that through a different company because our main insurers will not insure soft play. So we have to separate those things out. And of course, all of this is risk. And some of these risks are risks that have been taken on by principal councils self-insuring, whereas we will be going to the market. So to conclude my bit, for me, it comes down to whether we want to sit as bystanders and watch how a move to unitary council goes and then react. Or are we going to take this opportunity to use time between now and vesting day for those new authorities to review our capacity, create a strategy, and ensure we have the lessons learned from our colleagues in there? So for Simon, I'm converted. I'm going to take notice. That's it. So over to you again, Chris.
Fantastic. Thanks very much indeed, Colin. Kind of dual summary there of your excellent KEG dissertation and peppered there with references to your experience as clerk to Hill Town Council. Thanks so much for that. Really, really fascinating. And I think builds on what Simon was saying. Really interestingly at the start, a lot of food for thought there, especially for Q&As later from delegates. Thanks for that, Colin. Introducing Helen. Helen's council had to recently, Helen, I'm hoping I'm getting this factually correct, increase its precept, didn't it, Helen, by £2.5 million and take on a raft of different services and assets from Shropshire Council. Shropshire Council, like Somerset Council, kind of leaning into Simon's point a bit, actually, which is again directly relevant. Struggling to be financially viable sometime after they were created, interestingly, a bit like Cornwall Council back in 2009, not necessarily an immediate issue, but without Helen's council and some of the other larger councils in Shropshire, they'd be absolutely stumped now, and that the same has been borne out in Somerset as well. So yeah, the floor is yours, Helen. Looking forward to hearing some real, meat on the bone here. A fascinating discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to Nalp for inviting me to speak today. I wanted to use my time to talk about Shrewsbury Town Council's recent journey, and one that I suspect that will resonate with many of you. So stepping up and taking on significant assets and services from our principal authority, and doing so at pace, and doing so in a financial environment that is at best constrained. So this isn't a theoretical case study, it's quite a live one, it's complex, and it is still evolving as I speak. So why do we do this? Like many county areas, Shropshire's faced sustained financial pressure. The reality is that the upper tier authorities are increasingly having to prioritise statutory services, leaving discretionary services like parks, public realm, community assets quite vulnerable and potential for loss. So rather than those services diminish and potentially cease, the Town Council made a strategic decision to step in. So both the Town Council and Shropshire Council presented reports to their respective Policy and Resources Committee and Cabinet about developing a framework for delegation. And this is enshrined in a formal delegation framework, which will allow for all sorts of services to be transferred to the Town Council. So first it was around street scene services, including litter picking, bin emptying, street sweeping, weed killing, graffiti removal, and lifebuoy inspections along the river. And now we're working our way through to discussions around CCTV monitoring, libraries, museums, and in effect, anything that's of a non-statutory nature within the town. So this is on top of the grounds maintenance function that we have already done since unitary creation in 2009. So we're responsible for cutting all of Shropshire Council's grass. We do all the bereavement services for Shropshire Council. We look after their trees. So we have a huge portfolio as we go along. So this is not a light touch arrangement. It represents a fundamental shift in responsibility from the principal authority to the parish council tier. But the financial reality is that there's no magic money pot. We're not photocopying any money. I wish we could. And this transfer is not fully funded. And there is often a perception, particularly outside of our sector, that when services are devolved, funding follows in a neat and sustainable way. That has not been our experience. The funding that accompanied this agreement is partial, it is time limited, and in real terms, it's insufficient to meet the full cost of delivery at the standard that our residents expect. So we have faced a choice. Do we allow the service to decline under financial pressure, or do we step up locally, take control, and find a way to sustain them? And we chose the latter, but that choice has come with consequences. So as Chris has said, to make this work, the Town Council has had to significantly increase its precept. So we nearly doubled it from 2.4 million to 4.8 million. And that in a Band D scenario, that relates going up from £87.04 to £172.23. And if anyone has sleepless nights, I would urge you to look at our January full council agenda and the devolution report I did. It was 499 pages long, and I would say this is the framework that you follow a service devolution, because we thought of everything, because we had a few councillors who were really against it, so we had to really prove that it was a good idea to do so. So a lot of information in there that you're very welcome to borrow with pride, as they say. Now, I won't pretend it's easy. Increasing the precept at scale raises legitimate concerns, both for residents, for businesses, and for our members. But we had to be honest about that. And this wasn't about marginal increases. It was about a step change in what the town council is and what it delivers. So our approach rested on 3 principles. Firstly, transparency. We were clear with residents. Service is not free. And if we are to protect and enhance those locally, they must be paid for locally. Secondly, accountability. We emphasise that decisions about these services would now sit closer to the community, and local people would have a stronger voice in shaping priorities. And thirdly, value. We demonstrated that the town council would deliver those services efficiently and responsively, and often with greater flexibility than the principal authority could. Even so, it required political courage and clear communication, and there was no avoiding that. And we were coming on the back of elections last year, so our new administration was the first time they'd been actually in power. So it was a lot of risk and a lot of confidence building we had to do with elected members. So we delivered a newsletter to every one of our 39,000 households, setting out the financial constraints of the unitary authority and what could happen. And we opened a survey to gauge opinion, and in 3 weeks we received 1,200 responses, and 80% of those agreed to the precept rises. And at that time, at the time their council tax bills dropped on the doorstep, I've had 5 complaints. So 5 out of 75,000 residents. I think it just shows if you get the commas right, you take people with you. But this is not just a financial exercise. This has operational implications. So taking on assets and services at this scale and at speed is not just about budgets, it's about organisational transformation. So we've had to expand our operational capacity, setting up a completely new team, recruiting new staff, integrating staff from Shropshire Council under 2P, and upskilling everyone to work together and to embed themselves in the town council's culture and ethos. We had to procure road sweepers and side loaders in 6 weeks, which I'm sure everybody on this call will know that getting plant at that speed is exceptionally difficult. We've had to develop new systems for asset management and service delivery, and we've had to strengthen governance and oversight. And in effect, we've moved from being a relatively traditional town council to a fully local service delivery organisation, primarily responsible for public realm in its very broadest sense. So that shift has required investment, not just financially, but in terms of leadership, culture, and capability. And one of the biggest lessons here is that devolution is not a simple transfer, it is transformation. So what has that meant for Shropshire Council? So let's be candid about the wider system impact. By taking on these services, Shrewsbury Town Council has provided significant financial relief to Shropshire Council at a time when they have staved off bankruptcy by receiving £200 million of emergency financial support. That's a short-term fix, that's not a long-term fix. So in simple terms, we have removed a cost pressure from the principal authority's budget at a time when that pressure is acute. But that is, and it's quite important that savings have not disappeared, they've just been redistributed. So it now sits with the residents of Shrewsbury through the Town Council precept. So while this arrangement supports the financial stability of the upper tier, it does raise important questions about equity and consistency. So what happens in areas without a capable and willing town council? Are we creating a postcode lottery for service provision? And how do we ensure fairness across a county footprint? And these are not questions with easy answers, but they are questions we need to engage with in our sector. So for me, what are the key learnings? Firstly, I think you need to be clear about why. This cannot be just about filling a gap that funding cuts need to be filled. This is about a positive vision for local service delivery and one that residents understand and support and buy into. Secondly, it's about don't underestimate the financial gap. Assume the funding will not fully cover the costs and plan accordingly. So build robust financial models, stress test your assumptions, and be prepared for ongoing pressure. Third, it's about communication. It is absolutely everything. You need to take the residents, members and stakeholders with you. And that means being honest about trade-offs and being clear about the benefits. Fourth, invest in capacity early. You cannot deliver expanded services with the same staffing structure and resources, and you have to invest in people, systems and processes from the outset. Fifth, partnership still matters. Even the devolution, the relationship we have with Shropshire Council remains critical. The devolution agreement is not the end of that kind of relationship. In effect, it's the start of a new one. And be prepared to evolve. This is not a static arrangement. Costs, expectations, circumstances will all change, and we need to build in flexibility to review the mechanisms. So I have reflected on what we have done in the broader perspective. What we're seeing in Shrewsbury is part of a wider shift in local government. Town and parish councils are increasingly being asked, and in some cases, they're being expected to do more. That presents an opportunity, and we are closer to our communities, we're more agile, and often more trusted at local level. But it also presents risks. If devolution comes simply a mechanism for cost shifting, without adequate support or strategic coordination, we risk placing unsustainable pressures on the parish council sector. So the challenge for all of us, individually and collectively, is to shape this agenda rather than simply respond to it. So in closing, for Shrewsbury Town Council, taking on these assets and services was not the easy option. It required both difficult decisions, organisational change, and a willingness to step into uncertainty. But it also represents a statement of intent that local councils can play a central role in sustaining and shaping the place we serve. The key is to go into this with your eyes wide open, understand the financial realities, be honest with your communities, invest in your capacity, and be clear about the value you bring. And if you do that, then devolution, whilst challenging, can be an opportunity to strengthen local democracy and protect the services that matter most to residents.
Brilliant. Thanks very much indeed, Helen. That I think is an exemplary case study to I think build on the kind of direction of travel Colin took us in, from the academic side, which itself had kind of built on what Simon talks about with LGR, and of course, as you yourself alluded to, Helen, Shropshire Council going unitary, kind of when it did, though Shropshire isn't fully parished, like some of those big county areas, did, probably did, create some of the financial difficulties in which, a principal authority that size had to operate, and having to go cab in hand to government for 200 million quid, as you rightly say, is indicative of that. And I think that's exactly where Simon's coming from, was the spate of new unitaries being just approved, whether or not they're county unitaries or not. Personally, I think Simon's right, actually, and that interrelationship with parishes, new or current, is key, and how they're going to be treated in the whole Devo agenda. So many thanks for that, Helen. That's fantastic. Now let's move on to questions. I've just been double checking the Q&A kind of section of this Zoom webinar package, and some of you have already posted in there about 10 questions. Some of them are statements, some of them are sub questions. I can only really ask questions which are relevant to all speakers, that they can all have a stab at answering, and which aren't statements, and probably aren't sub questions. So there are a couple that have been posted in there. I would encourage you, if you like some of the questions that have been posted in there, to vote them with thumbs up. We tend to ask them the ones which are within those parameters, got the most thumbs up and stuff. And also, if you do want to ask a question, please try to cover areas which haven't already been covered in topically in the questions. So I'm going to start these questions now. One of them has been asked by a guy called David Landon Cole, and I'm going to aim it directly at you, Simon, first, because your favourite phrase was judicial reviews, and you alluded to that. So David's asking, can he ask when JRs would be made? I mean, obviously, we're in the process of the bill hopefully getting royal assent today or tomorrow. It has to be by today or tomorrow before Parliament is prorogued. Assuming that the changes are made by secondary legislation, he asks, can that even be taken to JR? You probably, and I don't think he's referring to Dallas when he asks that question. Do you have a stab at answering that question, Simon? Because you know more about.
Yeah. So first of all, the JRs are very specific. They are based on whether the government followed the process and therefore made sensible decisions. And the only people that can really bring those JRs are the councils themselves that are implicated in the changes. So the JRs would only come from, at the moment, from the four areas of Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex and the unitaries, and Hampshire and the unitaries there, and they can come from any of those councils, districts, the cities of Plymouth or Portsmouth or Southampton, or the counties themselves. The issue will be is that the government announced these decisions the day before Purdah, and effectively all of those places have elections this year, and the councillors went off to canvass, and therefore there's been a political vacuum for officers, and the different monitoring officers had different views on it, but it was felt that it would be very difficult for JRs to be implemented prior to the conclusion of the elections in a week or so. And then you've got to wait for new councils to come in. And as I said earlier on, we're likely to see a significant change in the leadership of a number of those councils. It will be then down to them as new leaders, not just in the counties, but in some of the districts and the unitaries, to decide whether they want to then pursue a judicial review of that decision. They have to do it within something like 80 odd days from the original decision. So there's been a small window gone because of elections. They will have a short period of time in which to decide whether they want to pursue it. And again, it won't just be them as new leaders making decisions, will it? National political parties may be involved in wanting to influence those decisions. So that is the timescale. Though if they happen, it could delay both the decision making or and actually delivery of the structural change orders, which the government are planning not to do till almost December anyway, which is ridiculous that they've got any time to actually then deliver the unitary shadow authorities. They should be way earlier than that. But that is already a difficult timescale. It could do that, and it could also influence the timetable for the remaining 16 areas. If they're getting judicial reviews on these current decisions, they may have to. They may not, but they may have to then just hold those. So there's a lot of uncertainty depending on the outcome of elections, and it will be for those authorities or any authorities in those areas to decide that they don't like the decisions that have been made on the basis of a legal opinion which says government did not follow the process and make rational decisions.
Yeah, understood. And the government needs to be manifest in trying to prove to all of us that it hasn't tried to gerrymander and politicise. I certainly think the Local Government Boundary Commission for England would have something to say about that if there was evidence for that.
And just on that, we have written, the government said we've made it based on assessment of the proposals that they can be sustainable. I thought the word "can be" is interesting, and we've asked, okay, can we see that? We don't ask him for the ministerial judgment or the advice of civil servants, which you never get, but you say you've done assessments. And there are four questions asked in Parliament yesterday, and we've received the responses. We will not provide any further information on how we assess these. Effectively, paraphrasing, everything's out in the public domain. Well, it isn't, because many of the decisions that they chose, or the proposals they chose, have no delivery plans, have no financial plans, and have no way to be delivered. So it's interesting, isn't it, how that will play out. It will be for politicians to decide whether they want to pursue it based on advice from their officers.
Brilliant. Thanks very much indeed, Simon. Hopefully, David thinks that's answered his question. I'm sure it has. Colin, your super council is based in Suffolk. I mean, any thoughts, without putting you on the spot, as to whether a JR may be possible in that area? There seems to have been some an open wound in East Anglia since LGR was announced, 18 months ago, Simon, doesn't it? And it just doesn't seem to have ever really gone away. Yeah, any comments based on what David's asked or what Simon said, Colin?
To be perfectly honest, judicial reviews and all the rest of it, that I'll leave those games to the big boys to play. As far as the local councils are concerned, my interest is in the community I serve, and I've already run through the fact that we have time now between now and vesting day or day in court for judicial review or whatever it might be. And I just think it's probably not a good time for us to, as fascinating as it is, and I love the politics, as fascinating as it is to watch it all unfold. I was listening carefully to what Helen said, and it was interesting how she put in real life example of many of the lessons that other town clerks reported in my research. And, Helen said that she had 6 weeks to do a procurement exercise. Can we just all remember that was whilst Helen was running Shrewsbury Town Council? That was not in the absence of everything else. So my suggestion is let them squabble. Whatever happens, happens. But if we don't have a plan, a strategy, as Helen described, that has the backing of our councillors and our residents on how we can actually guarantee the continuation of the services that mean the most to them, then I think we would have wasted our time.
Yeah, concur. I think there is a golden thread there between, I think, what all three of you are saying, from the academic, the local, real life, and then the strategic, and that's clear. And I think certainly what Simon's talked about, I think colours the whole devolution debate, doesn't it? And hence the name of the event, Finance and Function, which is going to become more prevalent, possibly with the creation of up to new 40, 45 parish and town councils across the country. Although we're detecting some issues with it only being the successful authorities that then can create some of these new ones, because the dying ones were maybe a bit late in trying to set them up. So it does all bleed into that. Helen, just to bring you in on this one, has there ever been any point at which legal action was a possibility? I'm not sort of trying to be divisive in asking this, but either at any possibility when Shropshire Council hit the buffers financially, or when it was perhaps your council was feeling a bit perhaps dumped on in terms of the having to increase its precepts when perhaps otherwise it wouldn't have been. Or was the negotiation process always sustainable, always kind of sustainable enough during that process?
I think you've got to look at the fact we went through council elections last year, so the county went from being a Tory controlled county to a Liberal Democrat controlled county, and at the same time we went from being a Lib Lab hung council to a Liberal controlled council, and we have 5 of the cabinet members of Shropshire Council who sit on the town council. So the town council now has considerable power. And it was really ahead of those elections. We had conversations with the leadership of the Liberal group, because they were the ones who you could see right from the outside they were going to win the elections. It was like, how big and brave and bold do you want to be? So it was all very much of, it was within their manifesto that if we come into power, we're going to cascade as much service delivery down to the parish councils as possible. And we're actually going to make parish council front and centre of any kind of discussions, and we're going to bring them to the table. So there's never really been a need for any kind of judicial review, because I think there is that sentiment there. So this year they've been piloting 4 areas to do service devolution, of which Shrewsbury was clearly the biggest. But it paves the way really for other parish councils to do that. So when I spoke about the devolution agreement, that devolution agreement could be anywhere. It sets the governance arrangements for how the 2 councils are going to work. And, we've always committed to supporting the parish councils in being able to deliver that. We do a lot of work for any parish councils anyway. And and setting them up with the parameters to be able to do it. I think that's where we saw it.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Thanks so much. Yeah, it came up recently as well, I think possibly in one of NELC's policy consultation responses about the importance of super councils, the size of yours and Colin's, to service outlying smaller kind of councils in things like community transport, and in other kind of almost like speed camera type scenarios where you can, share your expertise and, to use Colin's phrase, knowledge with smaller councils to empower them as well is a hugely kind of important role in a kind of hub and spoke sort of way. Ideally, as Simon said last week in the dry run for today's event, with a fully parished kind of set of areas under the unitary of whatever size of the unitary is, that would be certainly something NELC would support. Moving quickly on, David Newman, who is on our larger councils committee and chair of our climate emergency network, who we saw yesterday, has posted a question, which is quite a good one. Links to something you talked about, Colin, in terms of knowledge and training. He asks, what support, in brackets, advice, knowledge or training is there for parish councils investigating taking on services? We talked about different sizes of parish council, and a couple of comments have come in the chat about how some of this relates, as you just implied, actually, Helen and Colin stated, to smaller and perhaps medium-sized councils. I'm mindful that you're both super councils. But actually, despite the fact that our small councils committee has said that, most small councils aren't interested in taking on devolved services, are they? Well, actually, some of them might have to be in the way you just described, Helen, because if they want certain services to continue that were hitherto provided by a county council or a unitary council, the option is use it or lose it. It dies unless they step in. So yeah, moving to you, Colin, first. Do you have any views on what support there may generally be available from society or elsewhere in the sector on taking on devolved services?
I think there's one of my findings from my research, and one of my conclusions was that it needed to be better support in this process, and that's something that NELC and the LGA can really take on to make sure that the transfer of knowledge can happen better. Obviously, for some things, the county associations that we're all members of can direct that to training that might be available locally, and indeed may be able to commission training that is pertinent to their area if they're getting a lot of the same requests in. I think it is important to bear in mind that this isn't just about town councils. If you are in a parish that is on the coast, is a small parish but happens to be a tourist destination, then the public toilet by your beach that may well be maintained at the moment by your district council could be, as far as tourists coming to your beach, could be a vital piece of asset that you would want to make sure is maintained. So I don't think anyone can sit back and watch this. I think actually looking round our parishes and thinking about how are these things provided? Why is that thing clean? Why is that thing maintained? Who's looking after those services? And knowing the answer to that is probably a good thing in its own right, that we all ought to know our parishes better than we do, but it's also the first step in actually saying, what things are important and what things can we not lose. We all know there's the under the Locality Act, there was this thing about assets of community interest, and people register them. But I've always said to people, if you register that community asset, you get like 3 weeks to actually do something about it. You actually get no more time than anybody else to put your plan together. So if you've identified something that you think is a community asset, surely then you need to start putting a plan together. And that plan might be, and I know that we move away from public stuff, but if it's your local pub, and it's a community asset, then there should be a plan of what are you going to do if you ever need to do anything? And B, it's much easier to save assets before they start falling. So if you really value the pub, how about having a conversation with the landlord about how you might be able to work together to get a community shop in one part of the pub or something like that? So all these inventive ways in which we can preserve the assets, whether they're private assets or public assets, I think everyone should be looking at, to be perfectly honest, because we value them in our community. And if we get an announcement that something's going to close, normally there's not a lot of time to react.
Yeah, completely. And also, someone mentioned, I think Helen mentioned, and you mentioned partnership. So it wouldn't be as though smaller or medium-sized councils, many of whom are town councils by name, had to take these things on themselves. And we heard at our larger councils committee, for example, Moulton Parish Council in Northamptonshire, I think has set up a CIO like Thetford has over in Norfolk, because it doesn't have the powers itself to attract grant funding as a parish council, but it can if it's part of a CIO, whatever that stands for. Forgive my lack of knowledge, and it can attract grant funding that can then
Charitable incorporated organisation, I think is.
I knew you'd know, Colin. I knew you'd know. And basically, yeah, it can deliver far more as a kind of partner on that than it can by itself. Helen, you've got extensive experience in the sector. Is there anything you're aware of that society provides in terms of devolution or kind of finance and function advice for parishes of general size that you're aware of?
There is a document that the society did. I think it was more focused around district councils and that kind of engagement with the parish council sector. So there might be bits that you can pick out from there. I would sort of, if there's people on this call are thinking about doing it, I would urge you to look at the report that we did for council, because it was done probably out of a bit of mischief more than anything, because the opposition councillors wanted more detail and they really got more detail. But then when I finished doing it, I said, if that isn't the definitive guide on how you'd actually set a devolution framework up, I don't know what is for our sector. So I would go and look at that and steal with pride.
Yeah, no, fantastic. In fact, Helen, if you can send us a link for that, that'd be great. Have you? Indeed, that's brilliant. And then someone has also asked us to try and include the Moulton CIO and Thetford CIO references. Well, I'll try and do that. That was talked about at a January online event when Thetford came and spoke. So that just, you know what I mean, general as many references as possible. That's fantastic. Simon, I mean, I'm not asking you to comment on the operational side of how parishes work, but equally, I was aware that I think the LGA did put together a publication based on with shared intelligence a few years ago on best practice for for devolution and transfer of assets, that kind of thing. Is there anything from a CCM perspective you guys would find it that you're aware of that we can share, or
we're 9 people and we focus on a small number of things to support our members, and we don't really do that. As an LGA to sort of lead in terms of training and support, but I do think you're right. What is already out there that can be repurposed in terms of examples, and then I think just Helen's example, it's inspiring, isn't it? I mean, it's incredible, both the detail and the speed which Helen pulled all this together is quite remarkable.
Yeah.
I suppose the question for Nauk is, how do we make sure that and there's loads of great examples, and it's been a while since I've done the Nauk Star Awards, a couple of years, but actually looking through some of that, there's so many great examples of some of the things that parishes are doing and the way that they've engaged. How does Nauk actually, as an organisation, sort of try and capture some of that? Because what Helen doesn't want is 500 people phoning her up and saying, can I see this? And I'll say that for you now, Helen, because I understand and know what that's like. How do we take the burden off the innovative so they can carry on being innovative, but while learning the lessons? That's the $1 million question, but it can't be beyond us, can it? As groups of, as you, the LGA in particular, less us because we're tiny, to be able to do that and share that experience and knowledge, whether that be masterclasses, whether that be Helen speaking today and inspiring people, and Colin talking about his research, all of that is there. How do we share it better?
No, absolutely, fully agree, endorse everything you've all said. And I think, if it's a real, I think what Colin said is true to colour this point, which is that actually, councils probably shouldn't shy away from this anyway. If they know that LGR is down the line, this event wasn't per se about LGR, but it would have been crazy to have had a discussion today without LGR, and so that's why it's been brilliant having you along, Simon. Is that it takes the sting out of the tail, as Colin said, but then actually, in the end, it's about residents, as Helen said, isn't it? And we've heard this so often, for example, about public conveniences as well. We're just organising an event in November about that, because we did a survey with the British Toilets Association, which just demonstrates and there was a headline in LGN during the week, some wasn't about public conveniences being in crisis, that it's always just even without the toilet tax being there, literally just, I think the phrase, dumped on with these public conveniences, and there being no discussion. It's only when principal authorities often can't run them anymore that the parish just steps in. There is no negotiation, and there's never any finance with the function. So that it's as well to engage early and not shy away from it. But if residents will expect that, and there's been no comms, as Helen said, if there's been no comms, then it could be cataclysmic. Especially if the precept has to go up. But if they're expecting these services to be maintained, these assets to be managed, then actually parishes almost have a moral imperative to do so. There's a question here, which will be the last one. It's from Laura Donovan. It's a statement which presages the question. So I'll mention the statement. I think initially it was aimed at Colin, but it can be answered by everyone. And I'll bring this in to you to answer first, probably, Helen, if that's all right. How can we justify building reserves when we don't know what we're putting them aside for? At this point, I don't know where Laura's from, but she says, we don't know what the district or county and ultimately the new unitary is likely to offer. So they are in an LGR area, don't know where. Can we earmark reserves for a just-in-case scenario? Helen, I don't know if that's an unfair question to lob at yourself on this one.
I think you do need to sort of look at your reserves level, because I would think that quite a lot of councils do not have the kind of reserves needed to do something like this. And I think there is that level of uncertainty, as Laura says, about when you've got the district and counties merging, what is going to happen. I would earmark reserves as a contingency service, future service delegation. As part of the budget setting that we did, there is a sum that's probably somewhere between £250,000 and £500,000 that has been set aside, not within the actual the budget itself, but they're going into earmarked reserves for that contingency in case they go bankrupt and they start to close services at speed, that we can act and be quite a flight of foot. I think one of the other interesting things is when you're in a parish council setting in a district and county level, I would be having the conversations with the district council now, because I think having the service transfer ahead of the unitary creation will mean that you'll probably get a better deal for it than you will with the unitaries. I'm just looking at the experience across the county, and I've spoken to a lot of new councils that have been formed. Oh, well, we'll do it once local government reorganisation takes place, and it never happens. We were fortunate in Shropshire, because there was the potential for a judicial review at the time from the borough council, that they created the town council and they created it as a working kind of organisation. And I would always advocate that where there is the ability to start to have those conversations with your district council, to encourage them, what can you do to help them ensure that they've got a district council legacy, because they won't be here next year.
Yeah, no, completely understand. We picked up this point across committees and networks more generally about, well, what happens to the functions of the dying boroughs and districts? Touching on what both Colin and Simon have said. We picked up one example recently where apparently officers were told, well, you're just all going to be stupid across. You don't need to do any work for the next year or something. I forgot who mentioned it. And actually, well, that hardly sounds encouraging for communities. But then again, maybe it's not their fault. But at the same time, it doesn't speak much for service continuity. What services can residents who probably expect business as usual to an extent, expect from councils, and a lot of where's the function going, the whole strategic authority thing, Simon, the colours part of this, who's responsible for what, it's all LGR again, isn't it? And it bleeds into what Simon said about, has this been thought through, or is it political? Colin, bringing you in just briefly on this one, it was aimed initially, I think, at you. Can a council like Laura's earmark reserves for a just in case scenario? Do you agree with what Helen's kind of said in the contingency context?
Yeah, I think Helen summed it up. I think the important thing to remember in terms of the rules around reserves is that councils are supposed to have between sort of 3 and 12 months worth of general reserves, and they can have earmark reserves for whatever they want as long as they can justify it. So what does that mean? It means, one, that you need to have a reserves policy that actually sets out why you have earmarked reserves. Now, it's the opinion of the parish council as to whether the reserve is necessary or not. So if you've come up with a reason that you think is good enough, that's all that matters. And in terms of the general reserves, normally what people say is smaller parish councils might be expected to have close to 12 months because the actual amount of cash 12 months might still be a very small amount, which could easily be ripped through. Whereas a very massive charity such as a massive council such as Helen's, could be argued to not need very much at all, because a quarter of 12 months costs would be a huge number. But I think this is changing the narrative. And actually, we had an issue. We've been talking to the district council about taking on an asset, and just one part of that asset, if it wears out and we have to replace it, would bankrupt us. So
Right.
Because we're moving into the territory that is normally and has historically been occupied by Leviathan-sized councils compared even to Shrewsbury. We're talking about councils that once upon a time were £1 billion budgets, and so they have huge wherewithal. If we're going to move into that sort of territory, then I think that councils as large as Shrewsbury will easily be able to argue our general reserves need to be pushing up towards the higher levels, not the lower levels anymore, because the risks are multiplying quite significantly. So I think definitely people should be looking to have a policy. Definitely come up with EMRs you think are needed, including property acquisition, contingency reserves, all the rest. But generally, this is an answer for those councillors who tell us we shouldn't hold so much of people's money. We should run our reserves down. Well, at the moment, that may not be a clever idea. It might be a cleverer idea to just let our reserves, even if you don't think you're going to take on services, it might be an idea to let your reserves float up. That's my thoughts on it.
No, very, very, very interesting. Final, parting shots from yourself, Simon. There is in terms of the financial viability of current and the new suite of principal authorities. We're aware of your view. Agree with what you're saying. Is it the case that you think any or many of these new entities will actually even have reserves, or are they going to just be, from the get-go, operating in a vacuum?
I think there's a long way to go to implementation. Some of the plans were beyond ridiculous and didn't even have, based on fantasy economics. Now, what then has to happen is people have to try and implement sustainable plans, but that will have massive implications for the services that are delivered and all the things that we've just been discussing here. Now, obviously, their first and principal thing is safe and legal, and then it's sustainable. Now, I believe that in many of these cases, that they'll be really challenged to do both of those. My best guess is that way over 50% of the new councils created, if they are indeed created, will be on exceptional financial support, either from birth or in the first year. And that is before they start unpicking services. So I think all of this has massive implications, and I couldn't agree more with Helen and Colin, is preparation, planning and reserves to be able to anticipate and react to the changes. And there's nothing better than trying to get in long in advance before these changes potentially happen, to see what you want to achieve in your areas, what your councillors want to achieve, and what your officers think is possible.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. Some of these kind of trends do have a golden thread, don't they? Whatever level of local government we're operating in, and it's clear from what you said, Simon, as well, that the government perhaps should have thought some of this through a bit better. Hopefully, the Armageddon scenario you paint, though I completely sympathise with it, won't entirely happen, but what you're saying very rightly is that it could happen. And Colin and Helen are saying, from academic and current experience, previous experience, that actually these are the lessons of what, in reality, of what's happened at parish level if you don't plan in advance, and having the parishes in towns having to pick that up. So let's hope that parishes can help at least. If LGR does proceed in these areas, that minimise any damage done by having financially unviable new unitaries. Just going to close the event now. We've run over, but that's been one of the most interesting online events I've ever chaired, and I really do thank you all hugely for attending and speaking today. So a huge thanks to our fantastic speakers, Helen, Simon, and Colin, for the brilliant and valuable insights and contributions today.